video for analyzing models, which is a main part of our upcoming summative for our bio unit. And so we can see over here on the left is our model that will be a part of the summative. And as you can see, it has 5 main parts: the phenomenon, the boundary, the components, the inputs, and the outputs. Why is labeled 1, 2, 3? Well, 3, 4, 5, 6. You don't have to do it necessarily this way. However, I would suggest you to identify the phenomenon boundary first. Usually the phenomenon is given, but if you have something from paper and you have to transfer it to this model and the model doesn't have any, the model has nothing, then put in the phenomenon first. Then identify the boundary. It is important to identify the boundary before identifying the inputs, all the outputs, all the components, is because the boundary limits how big your model is going to be. Without a boundary, your model can include everything in this universe. However, if you identify your boundary as to a cell membrane, it's much easier to identify all the components, inputs, and outputs. Afterwards, you can either do your components first or your inputs and outputs first. Personally, I find it easier to do my inputs and outputs first, since it's easier for me to identify what I need to put in for my components. For example, if we have something like mitosis, your boundary could be like the cell membrane, and your input could be like DNA or even like a parent daughter cell. Like, it's easier to identify inputs and outputs than identifying the components, because as soon as you have inputs and outputs, you can establish your connections with the components. And this will lead us to our next part. What is the purpose of models? The purpose of models is usually to make connections, simplify concepts, establish a clear line of flow of logic, and present ideas. And it's the same with any model. For example, our model over here, it presents a clear flow of logic of how the inputs change during the mechanism to the outputs. It simplifies ideas and simplify concepts by putting things down to components, inputs, and outputs, so we only focus on the main parts of this mechanism. It presents ideas by being a model. A model is used to establish ideas in a simpler way than writing out a huge essay. And make connections by you can draw the components in and you can connect them by arrows. And having a flow of logic also establish connections. And that's all for this bio review for analyzing models. Thank you very much.